Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going back to like the early 1980s. You know, the Cold War, like peak Cold War.
Right.
And, Canada found itself in a real predicament.
Yeah.
The U.S. wanted to test cruise missiles on Canadian soil. Now, this wasn't just about military hardware.
Right.
This was about Canada, like, grappling with its identity, on the world stage, its role in the Cold War.
Absolutely.
Loyalty to a powerful ally.
Yeah.
Upholding its own vision of peace.
I mean, it really exposed those tensions.
Yeah.
National security versus peace advocacy.
Yeah.
Loyalty versus independence.
Yeah.
It's a microcosm of the whole era.
Exactly. And we have some great material to work with today.
Yeah.
We've got a history podcast episode and some transcript excerpts, too, which is fantastic.
Wonderful. I love primary sources.
Me too. And these go beyond a dry, military history lesson.
Yeah.
We'll get to meet some fascinating figures.
Yeah.
Particularly Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau.
Right. He faced some incredibly tough decisions.
Right. I mean, he was a strong advocate for disarmament.
Yeah.
But he was also committed to Canada's role in NATO.
Yeah, that's a tough balancing act.
Absolutely. But one thing that stood out to me was just like how much public outcry there was.
Oh, yeah.
Like this wasn't just like a political debate.
No, it was very divisive.
Yeah. Canadians were deeply divided. Thousands of people protesting.
Right. There were, you see the intensity in the sources.
Yeah.
For example, 52% of Canadians were opposed to the tests. And Operation Dismantle, the peace activist group,
Yeah.
their membership tripled.
Wow.
It went up to over 2,000 people.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that. Like tripling your membership.
That's huge.
Yeah. Clearly, people were very concerned.
Yeah, and it wasn't just one group, right? Like it was so diverse.
Right.
Labor unions,
Right.
religious leaders, farmer diplomats.
A real cross-section of society.
I mean, some even like threw eggs at government officials.
I know. It really shows the human element of this story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't some abstract debate.
No.
It was real people
Yeah.
grappling with, anxieties and convictions about potential nuclear war.
Yeah, absolutely. So to understand, how big this was, we need to step back, right?
Right.
We need to look at the Cold War context. So the arms race between the U.S. and Soviet Union, we all know about that.
Of course.
But why Canada? What was it about Canada that made it so appealing?
Well, the U.S. wanted to test how these low-flying missiles would perform
Okay.
in, really challenging terrain.
Okay.
So they chose Primrose Lake in Alberta,
Okay.
really remote, desolate, and it resembled the terrain of Siberia,
Oh, interesting.
a potential Soviet target.
So Canada, advocating for peace,
Yeah.
being used as a testing ground for weapons of war.
Right, because of its geography.
Right.
Ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. That's like a tough spot.
Yeah, definitely. This is where Trudeau's dilemma comes in. I mean, he was a staunch supporter of nuclear disarmament, but
Right.
he was also bound by Canada's commitments to NATO.
Right. What did that really mean back then, though, to be a NATO member during the Cold War?
Well, under the North Atlantic Treaty, an attack against one member was considered an attack against all.
Oh, wow.
So that meant Canada
Right.
was obligated to participate in collective defense measures,
Yeah.
which included, potential deployment of nuclear weapons.
Yeah. That makes it really tough for Trudeau, then.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this put him in a really difficult position
Yeah.
when the U.S. wanted to test those very weapons
Yes.
on Canadian soil.
Right. So a powerful ally, a global treaty, his own beliefs.
Yeah,
A lot of pressure.
a lot of pressure. He was being pulled in so many directions.
Yeah. So what did he do? What happened?
Well, and this is what's interesting. He initially agreed,
He agreed.
to the U.S. request, and it caused a lot of controversy.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. I mean, this is a leader who spent years advocating for peace, trying to de-escalate the nuclear threat.
Yeah.
And he agrees to the testing of these devastating weapons,
Right.
essentially in his own backyard.
Right.
Yeah. It must have felt like a betrayal to a lot of his supporters.
I can only imagine. And we're talking about the early 80s, right?
Right.
Peak Cold War tensions.
Absolutely. The threat of nuclear war was very real.
Yeah.
It was a constant source of anxiety.
Right.
So no wonder people had such a strong reaction.
Okay, so how did Canadians actually respond to that?
Well, there was a huge surge in anti-nuclear sentiment. Protests erupted across the country.
Oh, wow.
Rallies drew thousands of people.
Okay.
Organizations like Operation Dismantle
Right.
gained huge momentum.
So these weren't just like symbolic gestures.
No,
right?
they had a real impact.
Yeah.
They really influenced the political landscape.
And the sources talk about how divided Trudeau's Liberal Party became. Like, even his own MPs were either, like, openly opposed or they wouldn't say anything publicly.
They stayed quiet.
Yeah.
The dissent must have been immense for Trudeau.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, a Gallup poll showed 52% of Canadians opposed the tests.
Right.
That's more than half the population.
Yeah, expressing serious concerns.
So it wasn't just like a small group of activists.
No, it was widespread.
Right. And it went beyond the tests themselves, right? Like there were geopolitical fears.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, one of our sources quotes George Ignatieff, you know, former ambassador to the UN.
Right, a prominent voice.
And he was concerned that allowing the tests could turn Canada into a target for a Soviet attack.
Imagine that. It wasn't just about the tests.
Yeah.
It was about the potential for Canada being drawn into a nuclear conflict.
That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Then you have, like, Edward Broadbent, right?
Yes.
Leader of the NDP.
Uh-huh.
He took a strong moral stance.
He did. He argued that Canada shouldn't be involved in developing weapons designed for nuclear war.
Right. No matter what.
Yeah.
For him, it wasn't about pragmatism or alliances.
Yeah.
It was about doing what was morally right.
So even within politics, there are very different views.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And the sources also mention religious leaders joining the movement.
Yes, adding that moral weight to the opposition.
Yeah, so this really transcended political affiliations, right?
It did. It touched on those fundamental questions of peace and morality that resonated with people from all walks of life.
So Trudeau committed to peace.
Yes.
Stuck in this seemingly impossible situation. Pressure from the U.S., massive opposition from his own people.
What does he do?
What does he do?
Right. How does he navigate this impossible situation?
Well, to find out what happens next and how this all unfolds, you'll have to join us for the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into Canada and the cruise missile controversy.
It's a fascinating story full of twists and turns.
Right. And we left off with Trudeau in a really tough spot. So what happened? How did he navigate this?
Yeah. Well, the sources show us some of the behind-the-scenes maneuvering.
Okay.
So apparently Trudeau met with U.S. Vice President George H.W. Bush in March of 1983.
Okay.
And he reaffirmed his personal support for the tests.
He did.
Yeah. But he also emphasized that his cabinet hadn't given final approval.
Oh, so it sounds like he was trying to, like, play both sides a little.
Yeah, a little bit.
Appease the U.S., but buy himself some time.
Right. I mean, it was a clever move because by stating his personal agreement, he's acknowledging the U.S. concerns, maintaining that diplomatic front.
Right.
But by highlighting the cabinet approval, he's signaling that it's not just his decision.
Right.
It brings in that element of Canadian domestic politics.
Oh, that's smart.
Right.
So he's not just reacting to U.S. pressure.
No, he's trying to shape the conversation.
Yeah.
And the sources suggest that he used this opportunity to urge the U.S. to be more flexible in arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union.
Interesting. So he's pushing for a more, like, diplomatic solution.
Right, exactly. He was advocating for this idea of nuclear suffocation.
Nuclear suffocation.
Yeah, it sounds a bit ominous, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
But it was a strategy to reduce the threat of nuclear war by limiting the development and deployment of these weapons.
So instead of just focusing on military buildup, he's trying to de-escalate.
Exactly, de-escalate the arms race.
So what did nuclear suffocation actually look like? What did that mean?
Well, it was a multi-pronged approach, really.
Okay.
He advocated for a freeze on the production of nuclear weapons.
Okay.
A reduction in existing stockpiles.
Okay.
Strengthening of international treaties to prevent proliferation.
It's basically like choking off the supply.
Right. Choking off the supply.
Okay.
And deployment of nuclear weapons.
So the world could move away from the brink.
Yes, exactly.
So a long-term strategy.
Long-term.
Right. Very different from, like, immediate testing of missiles.
Very different.
Right. But did it work? Did Trudeau's diplomacy succeed? Did he find that balance?
Well, that's where the historical interpretations start to differ.
Oh, okay.
You know, the sources highlight these different schools of thought.
Okay, let's hear them.
Okay, so one school of thought,
yeah,
liberal internationalism,
okay,
they view Trudeau as a genuine peacemaker.
Okay.
They say his agreement to the tests was tactical.
So it was like a maneuver.
A maneuver, right.
Okay.
A necessary concession to keep Canada in good standing with NATO.
Right.
And to use that position to advocate for peace globally.
So he was playing the long game.
The long game, yes.
Okay.
They point to his efforts with arms control talks,
right.
his promotion of nuclear suffocation.
Right.
It's consistent with Canada's role as a middle power.
Right, trying to bridge divides, find common ground.
Exactly.
But not everyone sees it that way, right?
No. Another group, the Realists.
Okay.
They offer a more pragmatic take, maybe even cynical. They argue that Canada's participation in NATO, including the missile testing, it was about realpolitik.
Okay.
Doing what was necessary to maintain that alliance with the U.S.
Even if it meant sacrificing some morals.
Yeah, potentially. They might acknowledge Trudeau's commitment to peace.
Okay.
But they think his actions were ultimately driven by a need to protect Canada's security.
Okay.
And its economic ties with the U.S.
So national interest and the balance of power were more important.
Yeah, you could say that in the context of the Cold War, sometimes ideals take a back seat to strategic considerations.
Very different views of Trudeau's motivations.
Very different.
What about that third perspective? Social history.
Oh, yeah. They bring a really interesting angle.
Yeah.
They shift the focus away from the politics onto the impact on ordinary people and the broader social and cultural changes.
So less about Trudeau, more about the people.
Right. They see the anti-cruise missile protests as a societal awakening, evidence of a growing awareness of the dangers of nuclear war.
Right.
And a desire for greater citizen engagement.
So people finding their voice.
Exactly. Challenging the status quo.
So regardless of Trudeau's intentions or the international politics, the real significance is the impact on the people.
Right, and their relationship with their government.
Yeah.
It highlights the power of these grassroots movements and public pressure.
Even if they don't get what they want immediately.
Exactly. They spark a conversation, influence policy changes in the long run.
That's interesting. So it wasn't a complete victory,
No.
but it wasn't a defeat either.
Right.
Okay, and you mentioned there was one more perspective, right?
Yes. Cold War historiography.
Okay.
This looks at the controversy through the lens of Canada's relationship with the U.S.
Okay.
It focuses on the tension between Canada wanting autonomy, but also relying on its powerful neighbor.
Yeah, wanting to be your own nation, but also being tied to this bigger power.
It's a classic struggle, isn't it?
Yeah.
This perspective argues that this controversy forced Canada to confront some hard truths
about
its place in the world.
Okay.
Could it truly act independently?
Right.
Or was it destined to follow the U.S. lead on defense and security?
It's a question a lot of countries face, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just Canada. So we've explored the historical context, the public outcry, the politics, the different historical interpretations.
We covered a lot.
We have. But what about the outcome? Did those cruise missiles actually get tested in Canada?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that leads us to the final chapter of this story.
So to find out what happened and the ultimate consequences, you'll have to join us for the last part of our deep dive.
Welcome back to our deep dive. You know, we're in like the final chapter now of the cruise missile controversy.
The moment of truth.
Yeah. So tell me, were those cruise missiles actually tested in Canada?
Well, they were, yeah. Despite the protests, the division in his party, Trudeau gave the go-ahead. I was kind of hoping for a different ending, you know?
I know. It would be nice.
Like maybe some last-minute diplomacy or...
Right, a compromise.
Yeah.
But it shows the tough choices leaders have to make.
Yeah.
Especially in times of global uncertainty.
Right.
Trudeau was trying to balance so much of vital alliance, domestic anxieties, his commitment to peace.
It must have been so difficult. So the tests happen. What were the immediate repercussions?
Well, thankfully, no nuclear war.
Right.
But it did strain Canada's relationship with the Soviet Union.
Okay.
And public opinion in Canada was still very divided.
Right.
It also raised questions about Canada's autonomy on the world stage.
I bet a lot of Canadians felt let down.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Especially those who opposed the tests.
Right. Like all their efforts were for nothing.
It's that struggle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Idealism versus realpolitik.
Right.
And it's often the idealists who feel betrayed.
Right. Because their hopes clash with political reality.
Exactly.
But you said earlier that the protests weren't totally in vain.
Right. They didn't stop the tests.
Yeah.
But they forced the government to talk about it.
Okay.
To have a public debate.
And about
Canada's role in the Cold War.
Okay.
And the implications of nuclear testing.
Okay, so they brought those issues to light.
Exactly. Raised awareness, kept the pressure on.
So not a victory, but not a defeat either.
Right.
And maybe those protests led to changes later on.
Maybe. They definitely contributed to a growing awareness
Right.
of Canada's complex role in the world.
So what about Trudeau? How did this affect him? Was he a peacemaker or someone who gave in to pressure?
It's tough to say. He was full of contradictions, you know?
Yeah.
Capable of idealism, but also pragmatic.
Right.
This event really shows that.
It's interesting how this event from over 40 years ago, no, it's still relevant today.
It is.
Hmm.
Because Canada's struggle to find its place in the world is something a lot of nations face.
Right, that tension between powerful allies and your own values.
Exactly.
And it reminds us that history isn't just facts and dates.
No, it's a living narrative.
Right.
It shapes how we see the world today.
And this episode in particular makes us think about these complex issues.
It does.
National security, moral convictions, alliances versus autonomy.
All those big questions.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
But one final thought for you. Imagine you're Trudeau back in '83. Allies are pressuring you, your people are divided, the stakes are high.
It's a tough spot.
What would you do? How would you balance all that?
No easy answers.
No, it really makes you think about leadership and the choices that come with it.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.